History as it happens, February 2nd, 2021. The GameStop Revolution.
We are the 99%! We are the 99%!
A decade after Occupy Wall Street called out the reckless greed that brought down the economy, a different kind of protest is forming online, on Reddit. Its goal is to teach the masters of the universe an expensive lesson and make a quick buck. But the GameStop Revolution may also point to deeper problems with the American dream, as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
How is it that GDP has tripled or quadrupled since the 70s, that we've seen so much innovation, so much gain in productivity, so much building of wealth, and yet somehow for the typical family, yes, their TV is bigger, but that kind of progress hasn't made it to them very much at all?
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 5. And a quick programming note. We plan to deal with impeachment today, Nixon, Clinton, and now Trump for a second time. But events intervened. We'll talk about impeachment next episode, which drops in 2 days. Right now, we're going to talk about something crazy.
This GameStop situation is the craziest I think I've ever seen.
Average Joes versus big money players. And guess what? The army of average Joes are winning so far, at least for now. But the question is, for how long?
Well, they don't target just any stocks. They go after the ones that are heavily shorted in order to come up with a short squeeze.
This is really causing some issues for these hedge funds, specifically ones like Melvin Capital, who doubled down.
The price is $248 per share, up 68% from yesterday's close.
Wall Street Bets. It's on Reddit. Now, a lot of younger people read Reddit. I read Reddit because younger people read it.
The definition of the market is speculation. When you buy and stay long a stock, you're speculating the profits you hope are going to come finally appear.
I'm sure you've read about it by now. A big group of amateur stock traders on the Reddit thread Wall Street Bets poured their pennies into GameStop stock to kneecap a hedge fund short seller. They pushed the share price as high as $483. As I speak into this microphone, the price is $231, so if you bought high, you're not doing well at the moment. What propelled this to front-page news was the fallout. Robinhood, a trading app founded in 2013 by a couple of dudes who wanted to democratize finance, found itself needing to raise $3.5 billion with a B dollars to beef up its margin call, its cushion of cash, as required by regulators. Robinhood also restricted trading in GameStop and other companies the Reddit revolutionaries were gambling on. That infuriated not only them, but also members of Congress as far apart on the ideological spectrum as Ted Cruz and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Beyond the immediate impact on Wall Street and the financial markets, I saw something else here. If you take some time to read the Reddit thread, you'll see some posts saying basically, look, I work 40 or 50 hours a week. My job stinks. My salary is stagnant. So why not game the system like the big shots do? Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I heard echoes of the Occupy Wall Street protests and the general anger among ordinary Americans that the real economy doesn't work well enough, hasn't worked well enough for decades. And our political leaders have protected the powerful instead of listening to the needs of the powerless. Too much? I don't know, but we're going to talk about it right now with a conservative who believes his fellow Republicans and many on the right in general ignore these grievances at their peril. He's Oren Cass, executive director of American Compass. That's a new organization that he says is trying to change the way conservatives think and talk about economics. Oren Cass was domestic policy director for Mitt Romney when he ran for president against Barack Obama. Allow me to congratulate you, Oren. You're the first non-historian to appear on the podcast, with the exception of my fellow reporters here at the Times, of course. Let's try to place a historic lens on this conversation, at least at the start. The '08 crash, death from above. Powerful institutions would have wrecked the economy had it not been for the aggressive intervention of the Bush administration to bail out the financial sector. This current Wall Street imbroglio is an insurgency from below, a bunch of Reddit dudes trying to sink a hedge fund, and it caused a panic in a sector of the economy that you've had real qualms with. So why don't you start by explaining your views on the financial markets?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I think that connection to the sort of parallels of the 2008 crash is exactly right, because you know what we're seeing here, what we saw there, and what ultimately is wrong with our financial markets is that they are entirely disconnected from reality. Our economy is obviously dependent on them. When they crash, we all suffer. And yet the behavior that's going on in them that's causing all these problems has nothing to do with what we actually need financial markets for. The idea of an investment bank was it was supposed to be a bank where people had money to invest, and the bank then went out and found productive uses of the money, businesses, infrastructure projects that needed to use that for good projects. But that's not what these banks are doing anymore. That's not what hedge funds are doing. That's not what all of these subprime mortgage derivatives, swaps, and so on and so forth. And what's so funny about the GameStop situation, and what makes it such a fascinating one, is instead of just the folks on Wall Street all doing it amongst themselves, you actually had some other folks say, well, wait a minute, we can do this too. It's just imaginary piles of money going around in circles. It occupies our attention. It makes and destroys fortunes. And yet it's not doing what financial markets should do, which is helping our economy work better.
Simple greed and get-rich-quick schemes have been around forever, of course. But why do you think so many people are jumping at this opportunity?
Well, I think what really makes Wall Street such a target at this point is that they're engaged in what I call coin flip capitalism, which is a game where if you look at the typical hedge fund or private equity fund, they don't even perform better than random. They don't do any better than just putting your money in an index fund. And yet you see those folks getting so rich. They all place their bets. Some people win, some people lose. And no matter what, they still collect the fees. I think if you are looking at that from the outside, you see it and you say, well, wait a minute, that's not reasonable. I think the general sort of dislike of billionaires is unreasonable and overblown. There are people who earn a lot of money building incredible companies that do real valuable things, incredible innovations that make our lives better. But that's totally different from, well, I started a big hedge fund and my bets came through, and so here I am. And so I think the GameStop, it's going to be a phenomenal movie someday. I mean, it's almost like a Tom Wolfe novel. It's just this incredible holding up of a mirror to everything that is ridiculous about Wall Street. And they're saying, well, what if we do it on Reddit or from our basements? What do you think then? And people are saying, wow, yeah, this actually is pretty ridiculous.
And we all have a stake in preventing it from getting ridiculous. Just look at retirement savings, right? People don't have pensions like they used to. Our 401ks are tied up in stocks and bonds.
Well, and that's why I say, this is almost like a satire or a parody of what typically goes on in Wall Street, because the reality, for as much fun as folks are having with this and all the attention it's getting, it's not as if it poses some systemic risk to anything, but it calls attention to behaviors that are a systemic risk. In other words, this is just GameStop, haha, kind of funny, but what on earth are these large financial firms who, by the way, let's not forget where they get their money from, right? A lot of times they're investing state pension funds for public workers. They're investing endowments for other kinds of institutions. How are they going out and not just shorting stocks, but shorting more than 100% of the total float of the stock? They're literally borrowing shares that have already been shorted and reshorting them. It's the exact same attitude that in 2008 led them to do the same thing with the entire nation's mortgage market, taking totally unacceptable risks where they reap any rewards and any disasters land back on everybody else.
Echoes of 08, right? And the residual anger that they bailed out Wall Street but not Main Street. The sense that the financial markets can recklessly gamble while ordinary people struggle to keep pace. And in the ensuing decade, the anger at the so-called establishment probably explains at least some of Donald Trump's appeal to blue-collar labor. So, Orrin, your work now is to change the way conservatives think and talk about economics. Can you tie all those threads together to explain what you're up to?
Yeah, it's a lot of threads. I'll see if I can clump them into a ball at least.
And we can pick them apart and go slow.
Well, look, I think a place to start, which is sort of where you started your question, is the reality that the real economy is not working for an awful lot of folks. There are some very esoteric debates among economists about, have wages not gone up at all for decades? Have they gone up a little bit? If you're just looking at like how big are people's flat screen TVs, maybe they look like they're doing fine.
Entertainment is cheap. I mean, yeah.
That's right. Entertainment, exactly. You can make a list of lots of things that are cheap, but among other things, the things that matter most, healthcare, education, housing, those are the things that have gotten expensive most quickly. For the typical household, for the typical family trying to make ends meet, at best, they have been treading water, and I think the fairest assessment of it has actually gotten harder. it is very, very difficult to square that with the sort of macroeconomic picture that we see and that we're told about. I mean, how is it that GDP has tripled or quadrupled since the 70s, that we've seen so much innovation, so much gain in productivity, so much building of wealth, and yet somehow for the typical family, yes, their TV is bigger, but that kind of progress hasn't made it to them very much at all. That disconnect, I think, underlies a lot of very reasonable frustration that's out there. And the sort of Wall Street experience is the exact flip side of it. That just as you can talk about the quintessential family that has one or two parents working hard and not necessarily making ends meet, on the other side of it, you have these activities that just you say, what is this for? What are you contributing to the society? And how even under the story we tell about our economy and the way it works and the way it allocates rewards, how do we square that story with where we see so many of the rewards landing?
When I read the Reddit thread, Wall Street Bets, it reminds me of Occupy Wall Street or Occupy K Street, the protests I covered here in Washington. That was a movement mostly on the left, but it seems to me after the 2008 crash, there was cross-party anger, general anger among ordinary Americans at the way Wall Street behaved. I often hear on the left that Republicans, despite all this, continue to convince Americans to vote against their economic interests. Do you believe that's true?
It's certainly not true. I mean, I think the place to start is to think about, to your point, some of this should be bipartisan. And I think there are directions that the left of center has gone and is going that are really counterproductive and focus on the wrong issues. But there's also a real problem on the right of center where for decades now, what we call conservative economics or conservative policy, it's not really conservative at all. It's this libertarian theory of free markets deliver the best outcomes. And as long as we get growth, everyone will do better. And therefore, our policy agenda is tax cuts. And after that, our next plan is another tax cut. I think it's really important to emphasize that that's not conservative. It makes assumptions about how markets work that simply aren't true and aren't connected to human behavior and sentiment. It believes things that, for instance, inequality doesn't matter. Whereas I think any serious conservative would have to recognize the very serious consequences that inequality can have for the social fabric.
Anyone with two working eyes alive in our country today cannot possibly think inequality isn't a problem. But I interjected. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah. I appreciate your support in that point because, in fact, in your typical right of center conversation, that is a point of serious contention. And in fact, what I've just said is almost heresy. It is partly a result of an attitude that inequality just doesn't matter. And it's partly a result of an attitude that if we acknowledge it, well, then a whole bunch of other stuff we're really clinging to would start to fall apart. So we're just going to say it's not there.
Or here comes socialism.
Well, that's right. And that's something conservatives struggle with on a lot of fronts where, whether you're talking about poverty or inequality or even climate change, there's this fear that if we talk about the world as it is, then the immediate next step is we have to sign up for all the progressive policy proposals. And I think what it's crucial to say is, no, that's not true at all. The table stakes for the discussion should be talking about the world as it is, but that doesn't mean that big government program or progressive social agenda is the way to solve it. Back to sort of where we started, financial markets is a perfect example. Yes. Like, conservatives should be appalled by the way our financial markets are behaving, and they should be at the front of the line saying this is not acceptable, it's not good for the country, and we actually think we should do something about it.
Well, I recently finished reading the Princeton scholar Sean Wilentz' 2008 book, The Age of Reagan, and he makes a convincing argument, as have many others, that trickle-down economics didn't work then, it doesn't work now. Yet at the same time, it doesn't sound like you believe we need to go back to the economic policies that preceded Reagan, such as higher marginal tax rates, more private sector union membership, Keynesian deficit spending, and other aspects of the prosperous quarter century after World War II.
No, I don't think there's ever an option of going back, even if one wanted to. And I think there were big problems with that. I think the thing to say about Reagan's approach as an example is I think a lot of things that Reagan did made a lot of sense in 1980. That is, relative to the economy he inherited, relative to the challenges we had at that point, some of our marginal tax rates were too high in 1980.
Yes.
There were areas of the economy that were over-regulated and strangled as a result. In 1980, we had a problem with stagflation. In 1980, we had the Soviet Union to deal with in 1980, right? And so I think a lot of the things that the Reagan playbook said in 1980 were terrific. The problem is it's 2020 and we've got Republicans who that's still what they're pulling off the shelf and flipping through, trying to figure out which policy to choose. But the problems we have today, whether it's, as we've been talking about, the way financial markets are operating, whether it's international trade and the rise of China, whether it's the way that just technology and these platforms that tend toward monopoly have become increasingly dominant in our economy, whether it's the way education has started to divide Americans into a kind of college-educated class and a non-college educated class, that's just a different set of problems. And so just as the people who led the Reagan Revolution started from conservative principles and said, how do we solve the problems in front of us? We have to do that again today. We can't confuse policy for principles. We have to take our principles and say, how do we apply those to the problems that we have today? And that's going to look different than it has in recent years. And among other things, it's going to, I think, require a more active role for government.
And it should be noted that Ronald Reagan had an important pragmatic side. Despite being a very conservative person, he raised taxes, agreed to raise taxes several times after the initial cut. There's a lot of ideological rigidity on both sides of the aisle. I think that's an obstacle towards improving the future of work in America, which is the focus of your work.
Absolutely. And that Reagan point is an excellent one, which is, I highly recommend Henry Olson's book, The Blue Collar Republican, about Ronald Reagan, making the point that he was very pragmatic on issues of taxes and spending. He, of course, was quite protectionist. The actions that he took toward Japan in particular were critical to saving the American semiconductor industry, are what led to all of those Japanese auto plants that everyone now celebrates in the American South. What I think you see over time, just in democratic politics generally, is what start as really exciting and creative movements eventually sort of calcify into dogma. People just keep singing the same song, and eventually they forget how to sing the other songs, and then pretty soon they don't even really remember the words, and they're just kind of humming. Fortunately, you then also go through periods of renewal. I mean, the Democrats went through this in the late 80s. As Reagan was running the table, the Democrats, and particularly what was called the Democratic Leadership Council, was going through this decade-long period of rethinking going back to their own principles and asking, how do we address those to the actual challenges? And that's what ultimately led to, for instance, Bill Clinton in 1992 and what were called the New Democrats. And I think the right of center is really just sort of at the start of that process now. Donald Trump, I liken him to an earthquake. I mean, he certainly shook things up, right? And I would say, generally speaking, as a leader in government, he was a huge disaster. But one benefit of an earthquake is that you learn which of your structures were sturdy and which really were not. And you have a chance to rebuild something better. And that's where the right of center is right now. There are some people who are going to charge back in and say, let's just put back up those shoddy buildings. They were fine. But I really think there's a chance to undertake that same sort of process that's so necessary on the right of center to say, no, we are at a stage where I don't think the unions that we have today are effective at all, but some idea of organized labor, some idea that workers should have representation, should have those institutions in their community, should be able to bargain for better wages. Conservatives should love that. That's the small government solution, among other things. All of those are things that conservatives just, it's not even that they had the wrong ideas, they just haven't been on the playing field in a long time. And so that's what we're doing at American Compass, is trying to do that work from the rubble that we have now, build something that will have better staying power going forward.
Oren Cass, thanks for the conversation and good luck. We covered a lot of ground there, from GameStop to the problems with our financial markets to the future of work and public policy. As we discussed back on episode 3, the current crisis presents an opportunity, just as the Great Depression did, to redefine the terms of economic life, to reset the expectations of ordinary Americans about what reward should come from their work. As Oren put it, both major parties may want to set aside dogma and come up with fresh ideas. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
It's impeachment time again in Washington. The Senate's about to try Donald Trump on charges he incited a mob to attack Congress. From Nixon to Clinton to Trump, has impeachment been broken, or is the problem our broken politics? As we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.